How's it going, guys? It's Eclipse here and welcome to what might be the worst medium tank I think I've ever seen in World of Tanks console, and certainly one of the worst tier 10s I think that has ever been created. That is of course the Italian Centauro 45T. This tank is absolutely garbage. I mean, there is nothing that I actually enjoyed when playing this tank. It is worse in basically every way to the other mediums at the tier, and yeah, I guess we'll get into why that is and then show off some gameplay of when it can sometimes work but probably won't work 90% of the time. Anyway, first things first, the Centauro. Let's actually have a look at the statistics, then we'll look at it compared to some of the other vehicles and see whether or not this Ultimate Season Pass reward for the new season of World of Tanks at rank 100 is even worth the grind. So first things first, let's give a bit of background. This tank has a little bit of turret armor. It's supposed to have turret armor. Wargaming say you can go hold down with this thing. But remember, these are gigantic flat plates that aren't actually that thick in the armor itself. I mean, on the cheeks of the tank, you've got 135mm. This is very well angled to a degree. I mean, it's not exceptional, but as soon as you come up against heat rounds, this thing basically gets melted by everything. You also have the flat bits on the front of the turret as well, and then under the mantler with 300, basically, I mean, tank destroyers and tanks like this are going to be able to pen you if they're loading premium rounds very easily, and if not, they'll just pen you through the mantler. And the hull armor of this vehicle is absolutely garbage as well, so you'll get penned by basically everyone into the upper plate because it's only like 18mm thick, which I guess it is a medium tank, but when you're trying to make it into a medium tank hybrid, it has to have some good benefits of both classes, and this tank definitely doesn't. And the first thing I want to note as well, based statistics wise, is the hit points. It gets 1800 hit points, making it significantly worse than any of the other mediums in the game. I mean, the closest to it is really the Progetto, and you're looking at tanks like the UDES. It has an extra 150. The TVP is on par with this vehicle, but of course this is literally a paper vehicle, and then you're looking at T62. They all have 100, 150 more Batchat on the same level, and of course the majority of the other tanks having more and more, making this tank just super annoying to play in terms of its hit point pool. And yeah, just a bit of a pain in the backside when it comes to that, and means you can't take that many shells. It says you can go 55 kilometers an hour, but through gameplay it is quite sluggish. This tank is not particularly great at getting up to its top speed. It does have a decent power to weight ratio, but it's not outstanding, and it's certainly not as good as it feels in the Progetto, and I'm assuming that it may have something to do with the terrain resistances of the vehicle. Not entirely sure. It just feels really quite sluggish when you're driving around the battlefield. So yeah, I wasn't particularly the biggest fan, I guess, of this tank straight off the bat. But then you combine it with the fact that it's a pretty big tank. I mean, this tank is significantly bigger than the majority of the other mediums at the tier. You can see here kind of a size comparison, maybe not the TVP, but you know, that tank is basically paper anyway. It doesn't really matter. But the Centauro, supposedly having armor, doesn't have it. Supposedly having this top speed, but it isn't necessarily reflective of how fast it's going to be. It's not particularly great at getting up to that top speed, and it's not like exceptional by any means. You're seeing the TVP have 60, T62 having 58, a lot of the autoloaders having much faster top speeds, making this yeah, definitely one of the runt of the litter. And even some of the single shot tanks in the game and giant boxes don't have that much worse than the vehicle. So yeah, not particularly great in that regard. And with all of the benefits, the perks, the crew skills, etc., we've only got 523 meters vision, which I'm not going to lie is actually okay. But at the same time, you are pretty much on par with everything else. And remember, this is with a crew and all of the perks in this vehicle to make the view range as best as possible. So you're basically online with everyone. but the concealment of the vehicle is where it's absolutely dreadful. I mean, 318 meters is not god awful, but remember that this is the amplified. All of the rest of the tanks that are adjacent to it don't have any crew skills in them at this point, so yeah, not particularly great either. But the main issue I'm having with this tank is the damage per minute. So this tank is essentially able to have two different guns, and I guess the first and easy one to look at is the first gun. So this has a 7-second reload capable of dealing 3,412 damage per minute. Sounds pretty good, and for the most part I would recommend using the single shot on this vehicle because it is just ultimately way better in my opinion. The advantage that you get over the autoloader, which we'll talk about in a second, just isn't really there, and it doesn't really give me much hope to actually jump in and use that. But this one, the single shot, has some really nice rate of fire, decent DPM. Of course, this is fully kitted out, so you've got all of the bonuses you possibly can within this vehicle. You can't equip it with a rammer, which means that you're going to be a little bit worse than some of the other tanks at the tier, and that makes it just a little bit of a pain. Not the worst, but yeah, I mean, you get 400 alpha, and I guess you could look at something like an M48 for having similar sort of damage per minute, but of course without a commander. And just for reference, so we have a little bit of a reference point, you can see here when we jump in and put a crew in the M48, you've got 4,200 damage per minute, so it's an extra 700 over this thing, or maybe even slightly more, 800 damage per minute over this thing. So not particularly the best in that regard, but hopefully it will have good accuracy, and you'd be somewhat right. I mean, 0.3 accuracy is okay, but you have a 2-second aim time, so it's not particularly amazing, but you know, not the worst. But yeah, I mean, the single shot, the best way to play it in my opinion, but there are just other vehicles that I feel like are just way better. They're faster, they have the same damage per minute if not higher, they've got better view range, they have better concealment, and they have more gun depression. I mean, they basically have the same armor as well, so there is no real reason that you would play the Centauro CC45T if you are interested in getting the most competitive tank in the game. But I guess let's look at the auto reloader, since this is what this tank and what most people are going to want to be trying out. And you may try it out for a couple of games and then you'll soon realise that this tank is absolute garbage when you try and use it with this. So Wargaming come out and they say this tank has 3,000 damage per minute, but I'm not entirely sure Wargaming's calculations are entirely right, and when they do say that it has 3,000 damage per minute, I don't think they're looking at the right statistic for the vehicle itself, because what are they saying? Well, they're saying that you are fully reloaded on that first single as soon as you start the timer, you're fully reloaded with 4 shells. You pump out all 4 shells for 1,600 damage, and then you reload to be able to boost up that damage per minute. And don't worry, it takes you 12 seconds to unload those 4 shells because it has a 4-second intra-clip reload, making this autoloader horrible for if you want to get out that damage quickly. And yeah, I mean, there's another reason why you don't want to save up multiple shells in your magazine, is because you could have for another 6 seconds just reloaded and fired again without having to store them up and wait an extravagant amount of time. And you'll see there that it will take you over a minute to fully reload this tank, which is absolutely disgusting to be able to get a full clip off. And don't worry, because getting that full clip off will give you 1,600 damage, the same as a 57 heavy. And what was even more funny is that the 57 heavy will reload in about 25 seconds, whereas this tank, just to reload one of the final shells of this reverse autoloader, will take 23 seconds. So you could literally reload an entire clip in the time it takes this tank to reload the last shell in its magazine. And of course you have to add in the horrible intra-clip reload that makes this tank just despicable when it comes to trying to use it as a auto reloader and an autoloader, and definitely not the most fun tank that you will ever play in that regard. But my main thing, like we were talking about with the damage per minute, it says it's 3,068, but Wargaming is saying that you're fully reloaded from the beginning, you fire off all of those shells, and then I have no idea how they do the next bit of calculation, because it takes you another minute to fully reload the entire clip, which means that, well, over a minute. So, I mean, even if you half that damage per minute, so you get 30 seconds remaining having unloaded all of those shells, you're still not going to be able to reach the damage per minute that they've given. And after unloading for 12 seconds, you got 48 seconds to reload. And I guess maybe they're saying that out of those 48 seconds, you're going to be able to reload a percentage of that to then fire them off again. I have no idea why they're coming up with this, because in reality, you've actually reloaded for the entire time minute before that. And so the damage per minute in this case would be 1,500. So I have no idea why they're showing you a damage per minute of it being in the best possible case, because I could say that the 57 Heavy has a 4,800 damage per minute because it's fully reloaded as soon as it starts. It reloads one clip after firing off that first one, then reloads another one and fires it off. I mean, I just don't really understand why they're coming up with that, and it definitely isn't the case, because if you think about it, the best way you can possibly play this tank is to fire off the first shell in the magazine every time you reload. Any other loading of shells and adding an intricate reload is going to worsen your damage per minute. So it takes 10.2 seconds to reload that first shell. How many rounds a minute can you get off? 6 rounds a minute. Well, actually less than 6 rounds a minute if you're using it in the best possible way you can in this tank. So 6 rounds, 400 damage, 2,400 damage per minute. How are they getting 3,068? Are they saying that you're fully reloaded at the start of the minute, you fire it all off, and then you use the single shot for the rest of the minute? Like, I don't know why they're saying that, but I mean, it's completely not true. You will never come close to this value regardless, even if it is a value that is statistically correct, because what they're saying is that at some point you're using a reload and then you're unloading all of them and then blah blah blah. It will never be close to this at all ever in the game, and the accuracy is not particularly too fun in the game either. The penetration value is not particularly great, as your standard rounds 248, so basically means you have to fire premium if you want to deal with some of the tier 10 heavies in the game. And yeah, you definitely don't want to be bouncing in this thing since you have a horrible reload, and that's why I would every single day of the week be picking using the single shot over the auto reloader. But let's see why in the 2 replays we've picked today. And the first replay that we do have is, of course, on Prokhorovka, and this is a map that is probably not that well suited to this tank. It's big, doesn't have that much camo. It does have that reload like we've talked about with the single shot. That's actually pretty decent. I mean, you can have some good games. 3,400 is by no means the worst thing in the world, but it is definitely not good, and it's not good enough to really compete with a lot of the other tanks at this tier. But either way, you know, maybe it will be able to have some good games. Maybe there's something we're missing. Maybe the armor actually does work as you're intending. I mean, this replay probably not going to be the best showcase of that. I'm sure that there are going to be people out there that are going to love this tank and find it somehow one of the best tanks in the game. I can guarantee you 99% of people won't be part of that party, but there's always someone who will enjoy the tank, and I'm sure that, you know, you can enjoy the tank if you take it for what it is. If you accept that it is not a competitive tank, then yeah, I mean, you'll have fun and you'll find it good, as I did actually have a little bit of fun when playing this. I mean, a lot of the time you'll be frustrated at the fact that it just reloads for so long and you feel hopeless, or you feel like, well, I'm just using it as a single shot now and I may as well just pick a M48 pattern that reloads in nearly half the time for that single shot. And even when you are using the dedicated single shotgun as opposed to the auto reloader, you still have worse damage than the majority of the tanks at tier 10. So it's a kind of lose-lose with this tank, I think. And although I'm sure many people can play this correctly, and that having the choice to both fire it as a single shot and have the choice of actually fully unloading when you do need to, because sometimes you're not always firing, and I accept that, you know, damage per minute isn't always the most accurate way of predicting how much like potential damage or effective damage a tank can deal, because, you know, you can pump out all 4 of your shells in 12 seconds and you may not be able to constantly fire for that period of time at which you're reloading. But I can guarantee you that, you know, there's a big chance that when you are firing all 4 of your shells in the auto reloader, that you probably could have done it with a normal tank, because 4 shells in a minute, not particularly the hardest thing to actually be able to do. It would be a completely different story if you were needing to deal 10 shots because you had low alpha, but, you know, for the other mediums that have the same damage per minute, it's absolutely fine. But yeah, I mean, hopefully I'm not being too critical of this tank, but I mean, I'm being critical because that is what the tank is. I mean, it's trying to be this auto reloader, it's trying to have turret armor, it doesn't really have any of them, and yeah, hopefully you're kind of getting the gist. And I mean, here in this game, you're pretty inflexible. I mean, it takes a while to get up to top speed. I'm not going to say it's the worst thing in the world, but I did find it a little bit too slow for the damage per minute it's supposedly having, making trying to relocate a little bit harder than you would hope. And yeah, it just was not a fun or pleasant experience. And although we've picked up 2,000 damage in this game after nearly 4 minutes, yeah, I mean, I could have probably done a hell of a lot more, had an impact more in the TVP 250-51, which I would recommend every single day of the week, and it won't cost you anything to get that vehicle as opposed to this one. So yeah, I mean, if you're watching this in the future and you're wondering, oh, should I get the Centuro 45T, it's for free XP or it's available for gold, my first thing would be to you is absolutely not. You should not be purchasing this tank for gold unless it is the very last medium tank or very last tank that you definitely want to get on your game, or if you genuinely just really think you'll love the Italian tanks in the game, or maybe you don't even love the Italian tanks, you just want to get the Italian tanks. So that's really where I go with this tank. And the primary thing that I'm always aiming to do in tanks that have terrible damage per minute is go for tracking damage at the same time as getting damage, because this will elevate your game massively in terms of being able to get damage and assistance, and of course get more XP in your tanks. This tank, kind of not the best one, because in order to pen you usually have to fire APCR, which doesn't do that much module damage to things like tracks. It's a bit harder to track things with APCR. The standard rounds are AP, but they don't have the penetration to be able to go through tracks and deal damage a lot of the time reliably. So it's like a trade-off, like, do you want to pen more or do you want to get more assistance? And so it makes even getting assistance and damage at the same time a little bit of a pain. But you can see me here, I'm a little bit hesitant to go for the E100 since I really want to get rid of this AVRE, and so we know that he's not going to be able to poke up in the time that we're going to be able to go over the hill. We find the E100, I'm going for that tracking shot and also the damage. Unfortunately he was already tracked, but I decided, you know what, we'll get in front, we'll try and go for that damage even more. We managed to deal 4,500 damage, which is an okay game for a tier 10. It's nothing exceptional, but we aimed for the lower plate and somehow hit the tracks, even though the reticle was completely on the lower plate or upper plate. But yeah, I mean, we get a little bit more assistance, and of course coming top in the game with 4,500 damage and 1,400 experience, which is definitely a game I would expect to be a good one on a tier 8 vehicle as opposed to a tier 10. But this was the best I could do with the single shot after, you know, a few games playing in this tank, and of course limited on time because I wanted to get this video to you guys so you have it for reference and whether or not you want to actually go for this tank. So of course I was getting super salty about the auto reloader in this vehicle, and there's good reason for that, and this game is a real good showcase of that. You know, sometimes the auto reloader can work, but you have to concentrate super hard to be able to get it to work. And it is not a new player friendly mechanic whatsoever. So I think adding it as a season pass reward when you know that a lot of kind of casual players and players that are kind of going to be jumping in was maybe not the best idea from Wargaming. Maybe it would have been better to give a more generic tank that is slightly more usable for the majority of players. But yeah. You can see me here, unlike the traditional autoloaders, I don't bother saving Michelle because it's not actually worth it unless of course you're really close to reloading and therefore maybe it is worth it. You can see me here waiting to be fully reloaded. We fire off one and then here comes the horrible reload, 4-second intraclip reload, which kind of ruins this autoloader from being able to be very effective. And so every single time you reload you can basically add 4 seconds onto how long it takes, because the first shell that you're reloading, that reloads quickly. Second shell reloads 15 seconds but adds 4 seconds, because to be able to fire off both you need to wait that 4 seconds. So yeah, I mean it just gets even worse and worse for this tank when it comes to trying to be able to compete. And I mean mediums will rip you apart and they are not even far away from being able to continuously fire at you when you're fully unloading your clip. So yeah, I mean I just don't see the point in firing with the autoloader. And I mean in that scenario right there, the KPZ, he gets finished by the 279E on the team, and although, you know, not the worst thing in the world, we just had to fire our last shell, so that means we are guaranteeing that we're going to now have to reload for another 10 seconds, which might not be the problem with some of the other tanks in the game, but with this one, yeah, it really does suck when you don't manage to pen, or you don't manage to hit the target fast enough to take them out, like you saw with the previous guy. And you saw us actually bouncing off of the Progetto there, which is super annoying, but we've still done 1500 damage. I mean, we've been firing, we've been in the action as much as possible. I've tried to find as many opponents as possible, but it just doesn't seem to really stack up. Yeah, I mean, it's not particularly the most fun vehicle at all. And there you go. Granted, we weren't fully aiming on the Progetto, which maybe we should have done at that point in the battle, but I was hoping that I'd just be able to pen him. I mean, the majority of my crosshair was actually on the Progetto. We got a little bit unlucky at the same time as maybe not fully aiming entirely, but he was going to go behind cover anyway, so that, yeah, I don't know how much of a difference it really would have made. But starting to become a little bit tedious at this point, and we actually only managed to set the Centurion AVRE on fire, which is what we love, and that is exactly what you want when you're playing in a tank that has terrible DPM. Anything to increase the amount of damage you're dealing in every shot, that is ideal. Any ammo racks, love those in this tank. But now we're in a bit of a sticky situation. A Waffle E100, a tank that has a better reload and intraclip reload than we do, and of course can deal more damage and pretty much has the same level of armor, because tank destroyer. Yeah, I don't know how this is going to fare, but having done 3,100 damage and 500 assist, I'd be hoping that at least we can get one shell off. He of course hits us in the upper plate, pens us every time. So in this tank you've just basically got to try and avoid as many of those shells. He then manages to hit above us, but our intraclip reload being so bad means that we can't quite get the shell off. And now we're in a bit of a tedious position because we've got that horribly long standard reload of 10 seconds and the VZ was pushing towards us. Now he didn't fully aim entirely, and luckily we managed to finish him off before he fires his second shell. But you know, the Waffle is now fully reloaded. I try and go for the shell because I just want to get him out of the game. He can be a real nuisance. And then of course we get hit by the Centurion or one of the TDs, which is horrible. But now I'm trying to push with the team. I have no idea why there were 4 people sat around not pushing a Progetto waiting for him to reload. No idea what was going on in their brains, but apparently that's the best decision that they could make. And so I'm trying to push in, but I decide, you know what, I'm not actually going to get taken out for the sake of these guys. So I pull back, and even if I don't manage to get any damage, it's fine. But they all bounce off of him except the AVRE, because AVRE doing things that it always does. And so I'm now trying to push towards the enemy AVRE. It doesn't go very well. I mean, I've got 200 hit points left. The AVRE on the enemy team only literally has to hit us, and unfortunately we do lose the rest of our hit points, but we don't lose the game and we do actually end up winning. But yeah, it just felt like you can't really impact the game as much as you want to. It's just severely frustrating to play, and it definitely is a limitation when trying to win in your games and carry because of that damage per minute, and of course not really having any armor to back up the fact that it is supposed to have armor and be slightly slower than the alternative Progetto 65 from the tech tree. So yeah, I don't know, it's mediocre, and if not mediocre, awful, to be really honest with you. But you know, it's another new tank. I'm not against them actually creating balanced or kind of actually not that great tanks, because it makes it a decent tank look much better. And hopefully you guys did enjoy watching this video, and hopefully it was informative and let you know what this season's reward is all about. Even if it isn't what you were hoping for from the season. But either way, we will be looking at the AMX-30B2 tomorrow, so stay tuned, as that's going to be a very interesting video, because that tank is a completely different story than when it comes to the Centauro 45T. But either way, hope you have a fantastic rest of the day, and I hope you join me back tomorrow to watch that AMX-30B2 video, and I'll see you there. Goodbye.